Whoa, that's kind of late in the presentation to show up. Okay, so at the end of the last session, we closed with a very heartbreaking question in Isaiah chapter 64, verse 12, which read, "After all this, O Yahweh, will you still restrain yourself? Will you stand by idly and let us suffer so greatly?" So we're going to begin this session with God's very direct answer to this accusation. This accusation is that God's holding himself back, that God's artificially not paying attention to the needs of his people, and he's just letting Israel suffer. So hopefully, this answer is going to give us an important clue regarding that ongoing, ever important theological debate between determinism and free will, between God's sovereignty and free will, God's providence and free will. So, this last chapter is going to, this last session is going to take us through the last two chapters of Isaiah. And these chapters not only close out the portion of the book that's written in the style of what some call a third Isaiah, but they wrap the entire book. So once again, I want to flash this pattern on the screen, which I will several times tonight, which reflects that what we have here is a loop with bookends on each side, or maybe the bread of a sandwich on each side. So if you see that little arrow that just popped up, you will notice that it goes from D to D prime. So in chapter 58, the prophet indicted the servants of the temple, the priests, the scribes, the keepers of worship because they were corrupt. And now, several times in tonight's text of the two chapters, we're going to have the same kind of thing. In this case, we have the indictment of corrupt worship that we'll be spending a bit of time with. But if you'll notice, it says adding the promise of a transfer of leadership to the faithful. And so we'll see what's going to happen there. Of course, we're going to go all the way out to that final proclamation of salvation, including foreigners. But I think maybe Dr. Kelly's little outline is probably a little more useful for us right at this moment, because I really like the way he breaks it down thematically here for the last two chapters. First off, what we have is God warning people who have rebelled against God. And then in contrast to that, we have the promise of new heavens and a new earth with language that is amazingly reminiscent of what we see in the New Testament in Revelation chapter 21. And again, we come back to the theme of God's disapproval of corrupt worship. Now, as we get into chapter 66, we will look at the three major controversies that the prophet may have been addressing, assuming that the prophet is writing or the editor is putting it together in a post-exilic period. And we see the voice or the sound of judgment, which is contrasted in turn with the rebirth of Zion, which you don't get to have the rebirth without having the judgment, because you have to get rid of the sin, you have to get rid of the taint in order to be able to truly have the rebirth. And then you have the condemnation of pagan worship, that seems like it has crept in a very ugly means in what's left of the temple cult, even as they're trying to rebuild it after the exile. And we have the gathering of the nations on Mount Zion that I'll give you a little bit of map help later on. And then you have the everlasting punishment of the rebels, which reminds us that there is a cost to rebelling against God. So, right from the beginning, we have an indictment of Israel, though it's possible to make it an even stronger indictment, as Paul does in Romans chapter 10, verses 20 and 21. So, the first thing I'd like for us to do is to look at my translation of the first two verses of chapter 65 and then compare them with verses 20 and 21 of Romans chapter 10. So I, Yahweh himself is speaking, let myself be discovered by they who didn't inquire. I let myself be found by they who didn't seek. I say, check me out to a nation not called by my name. I stretched out my hands every day to a stubborn people, the ones walking on a journey that's not good after their own values. And the word used for values here is the same word that's used in Genesis chapter 15 and quoted in Romans when it says, and Abram believed God, and it was valued to him, reckoned to him, accounted to him for righteousness. And these people are walking a bad way, a self-destructive way, the wrong way, because of their own value systems, their own accounting, what they think is important. Now, the Apostle Paul quotes from portions of these verses in Romans chapter 10, verses 20 to 21. In 20, yet Isaiah expresses boldness, or you could even translate that, grows bold, and says, I was found by those not seeking me. I became visible to the ones not asking for me. Yet concerning Israel, he says, I stretch out my hands all day to a disobedient and backtalking people. Now, what you're immediately going to say is, these don't quite line up exactly. And Paul doesn't quote the part where it says, check me out to a nation not called by my name. So what's going on here? Well, what's obviously going on here is that Paul is quoting from the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament. And I translated in the passive tense in Hebrew, which emphasizes the idea that God who could hide himself and God who could be untouchable decided to allow himself, despite his omnipotence and his omniscience, decided to allow himself to be discovered. And he revealed himself. So in love, what's happening is God's letting his guard down. He who could be impenetrable makes himself vulnerable. And this is the answer to the accusation at the end of Isaiah 64. Now, August Piper takes a cue from a very famous Hebrew grammar that I use too, even though it was published in 1909 in German and in 1910 in English. But in it, he says this Nephal perfect can be translated as the same as the continuous present. I keep on doing this in Greek. So as Piper wrote, according to this interpretation, the Lord is uttering the truth that he reveals himself and he lets himself be found by people who don't search after him or haven't sought him. And this is a truth that is fundamental to the whole gospel. Now, as much as I agree with this early 20th century scholar, the Hebrew grammar specifically describes this use of the verb as an aorist tense when translated to Greek. And simply put, the aorist tense means something that has happened at a specific point in time that continues to have repercussions. But that isn't the tense that Paul put in Romans when he was quoting from the Greek Septuagint of this text. But the fact that the perfect tense in the Hebrew is combined with the present tense may enable us to say, okay, Piper is essentially correct, and theologically, he's definitely correct. God both did back then, and God does continuously now make himself available, even to people who aren't actively searching for him. Because if God didn't make himself available, if God didn't reveal himself, no one would have any chance whatsoever to find him. It's grace. It's God's initiative that's absolutely important. So in the New Testament context of Romans, Paul introduces his quotations from Isaiah 65 by asking in Romans chapter 10, verse 19, but I say, did Israel really not know? And this is equivalent to the English colloquialism when someone's skeptical of a remark or thinks that there's context or evidence that's been left out of an argument. But did they really? So for Paul, someone must have been advocating that Israel hadn't had an adequate chance to respond to God because they hadn't heard the full gospel. So Paul says, but did they really not know? And so before we get to these quotations, Paul quotes from Moses' sermon in Deuteronomy chapter 32:21, where God promises to stir up Israel and make them jealous, make them envious of a nation that hadn't so far had a relationship with him. And then in verse 20 that we have here on the screen, then Paul goes on to say, Isaiah was even bolder than Moses. And as Paul quotes the first part of Isaiah 65:1, it's clear that Paul has in mind the Gentiles who weren't looking for God, but to whom God revealed himself in grace anyway. Now, Paul doesn't quote the part of the verse that regards the nation that's not called by God's name. But the reality is, even in the Hebrew, that could fit the Gentiles because it uses the term for nation that we would pronounce as goy. Have you ever heard Jews discriminatingly call Gentiles goyim? It's an insult, and at the polite synagogue that we visit occasionally for performances, they say that would be a bad word. So anyway, Paul uses, the prophet uses the term goy, and Paul uses the word ethnoi, or Gentiles, to mean a foreign nation, a non-Jewish nation. But it could also be that in the Hebrew text, that it's a way that God, as he's speaking to them, is actually disclaiming knowledge of Israel. He's actually temporarily disowning them by calling them Gentiles. It's an insult. As one scholar said, quote, in the context of Isaiah 65, both verses refer to Israel. Paul, however, takes the first to refer to the Gentiles and only the second to refer to Israel. He clearly indicates this by the introduction of the second verse with, but he says about Israel, Paul's justification is in that notion that those who did not seek and those who did not ask for me would more appropriately be Gentiles. So Paul would know that just as Israel is the nation that God's making jealous in the quotation from Deuteronomy, Israel is also the subject of both verses. They're in parallel, which is the way Hebrews make an emphasis and help you to understand that. But the parallelism of Isaiah 65, 1 and 2 is changed by the apostle into an antithesis, into the opposite. Why would the Holy Spirit let Paul use the verses this way? Well, the truth is, both quotations can apply equally to Jews and Gentiles. Why? Because of humanity's fickle and inconsistent nature regarding God. So, this is the clear answer to the prophet's prayer. If men disregard so open an appeal of the love of God, they're hopeless. Nothing can save them. The sin against such love is like the sin against the Holy Ghost, of which our Lord speaks so hopelessly. Even God cannot or will not help the despisers and the abusers of grace. So then, starting at the end of verse 2, we see a list of how God's people specifically reject him with their behavior. As we've already seen, at the end of verse 2, they choose paths which aren't good for them based on their own values. As I said before, that word is built off of the accounting term that's often translated as reckon in English translations. It means assign value. But the truth is, so often what's valued by those who are out of favor with God, not in right relationship with God, actually becomes no value. It's air in one's hands, as in Ecclesiastes. Vanity, vanity, air, air, wisp, wisp, breath, breath, all is air. So then what we have is a 7-point sin list, with each point in the sin list being a participle. A participle is a verbal noun, so I translate it as the ones doing something, because this is why they're not in the right relationship with God, because they're doing something. So it's the ones, as we've already seen, who are walking bad paths. It's the ones provoking God incessantly. This is, they're in God's face, is what the verse actually says. They're in God's face and they're still being blasphemous and disrespectful to God in a disgusting way. Not just the ones provoking me to my face continuously, but the ones sacrificing in gardens, the ones burning incense on stone slabs. Does that sound a little bit like the Asian customs of burning incense just about everywhere? And so what we have are sidewalk sacrifices here in that picture. People who are sacrificing in gardens, like on tomb sweeping day, and burning incense. So this is part of the sin list. It's sacrificing to foreign gods, even if it's ancestors. It's burning incense to foreign gods, whether they're demons or gods or whatever. It's burning incense. So these are the sins. Not only going your own way according to your own thoughts, not only being in God's face disrespectful, but also actively worshiping false gods. Now, I used Asian, particularly Chinese illustrations here to talk about the worship of false gods. But the reality is there were plenty of false gods for Israel to choose from. And we're going to see some sculpted reliefs of some later in the passage as we get to them. But we're not through the sin list yet. We're only through 4 of the 7. Let's go on. Living in tombs. What? All of these can be tied to some form of idolatry, which is essentially slapping God in the face by means of your actions. Now, sitting in tombs or living in tombs was for a deliberate purpose. In the ancient world, people would sit in the tombs for the purpose of obtaining oracles from the dead. It almost sounds like trying to commune with your ancestors. It almost sounds like going to a seance, because it is. Essentially, what you do is you go into the tomb to try to get a word from the dead. Can you believe it? God's people were doing that. And yet we know that God's people do these kinds of things even today. And then there is an even weirder one: lodging in caves. Why would they do that? And what's that supposed to do? Jim Meilenberg wrote that it was incubation rites. And these rites were actually used in healing rituals in the old days. What they would do is they would either partially bury a person in the earth and then uncover them, and they were supposed to be reborn. It's kind of an ugly form of baptism, if you will. It's kind of a magical ritual, as you can understand it. But the idea was, since the dead have the secrets, and since the dead are beyond life, that if you were buried with them, or if you were living with them or lodging with them, you would be able to get their wisdom. And then, of course, the 7th one was those who are consuming pork. But before we get past this idea of symbolic burial, let me call your attention to the slide. On the left of the slide, there is a picture of the Asclepius Center at Epidaurus in ancient Greece. And at Epidaurus, what they would do is either partially bury a person or put a person in a cave for a time. And the hope was that this would create healing. And this is believed across the world in terms of primitives. Because, as I just said, symbolic burial, partial or total, has that same magical religious significance as immersion in water baptism. The sick man is reborn of it. And at this center of Asclepius, which were all over the Greek world, but this just happens to be the one from Epidaurus, where I know they practiced it, the sick man is reborn of it. And the practice is equally effective in getting rid of a serious sin or curing a sickness of the mind. Of course, curing the sickness of the mind is probably redundant because they believed that it was sin that caused you to be mentally ill, if you will, or to be open to the demonic or the evil spirits that would come along. But the idea was you would go in the cave and stay there until you got better and still you could come out. Okay, so we have that sin list: walking bad paths, slapping God in the face, sacrificing in gardens, burning incense, living in tombs or sitting in tombs, lodging in caves, and consuming pork, along with cups full of drink that are full of abomination. So then we have a summary statement at the end of that sin list of 7. And that summary statement has a participle that once again says something, but it says, the ones who are saying, stay distant from me, don't approach me. Don't approach me is literally in the Hebrew, draw near to yourself, which, sounds goofy, but the idea is, I'm too holy for you. And God says, there's smoke in my nostrils, fire burning the whole day. Now, the reason for this disgust to God, it's because when they say, draw near to yourself because I'm too holy for you, what they're saying is they found a higher sense of spirituality than God himself. Does that sound familiar? Because we have a lot of it that goes on in our society. Human beings would rather try to figure out something on their own, be it weird or be it mysterious, rather than submitting to God. So what we have here are symbols of divination. Crystals on the one side, although that's a little bigger than the crystals usually used for divination. The classic crystal ball on the right, runes that are cast, although, as you know, in early Asian divination, they threw arrows, or there were also coins that were tossed in a pattern, or sometimes just sticks. In fact, some of the games in Asia, like Ute, the Korean game where you throw sticks and you try to be the first one around the board, which is ostensibly about horse racing, but actually, if you look at the way the board is shaped, it's actually very close to an old divination chart that was used in both Korean and Chinese divination. And of course, on the left, what we have are tarot cards that are popularly used in our society for people to get their fortune told, although it's pretty disgusting. And it's definitely disgusting to God because look what he says. They are smoke in my nostrils, fire burning the whole day. Well, a lot of temples in the ancient world, including God's temple in Jerusalem, when the cult was functioning, and some pagan temples today have incense and candles or flames burning night and day. So in this case, the idolaters who are tending the fires, which represent false worship, are also stoking the heat of God's anger. Because the same word in Hebrew for nostrils, af, is the word for anger, af. Why? Because when you're angry, you have a tendency to sniff hard. And when you're angry, you have a tendency to stick your nose up in the air and, just really let people know what you think. And so, what God is saying is, this stink has really reached to me. It might ring a bell for you. Remember how in the first chapter of the book of Jonah that I'm going to be teaching in 2 nights, God tells Jonah to go to Nineveh, that great city, because the stink of what they've done have come up to his nostrils. And so God is angry about it. So God says, check it out. It is written in my presence, literally before my face. I will not keep silent because I will certainly repay, and I will repay it directly into or onto their bosoms. Now, I want to call your attention to that because this idea of being written is indicating that the judgment is set. The sentence has been finalized. It's like a legal decision. You know, we make that joke in business that the job isn't done until the paperwork is finished. Well, in this case, God's saying the paperwork is finished. But you're probably wondering, why did Pastor Johnny put that yellow highlighting on the word silent? Well, as we noticed at the end of Isaiah 64, the question was asked, how long will Yahweh keep silent? And of course, their hope was that Yahweh would come out of his silence and that Yahweh, as the mighty warrior, as their protector, as their avenger, would take their side. So they think God's being too quiet. They think God's being too passive. They think God's being too still. And God says, you're going to wish I stayed passive. You're going to wish I stayed still because I will certainly repay and I'll pay it back directly into their bosom. It's really going to hit you personally if you've disobeyed him, if you've forgotten him, if you've forsaken him. It's really going to cost you. That's what it's going to do. Now, so here's the answer. God isn't silent. Actually, God is being silent out of mercy to get people to turn, but they aren't turning. So God is saying, judgment is sure, and this is why. And then in verse 7, you're straying, and the straying of your fathers together will be paid back, says Yahweh. All of you who burned incense on the mountains and upon the hills dishonored me. Here's that false religion. Here's that false worship. Here's looking to something or someone other than God for your answers and for your meaning and for your power. And so God says, and I will measure out repayment upon their bosoms. It's going to be personal to them because of their former deeds. So it's written down. The judgment of the punishment's been recorded. And just in case the prophet's hearers and his readers think this is unfair, verse 7 reminds us that it's because of a recurring or a continuous sin of idolatry that was found among their ancestors as well as themselves. And that's the meaning of together. So neither God's people in general nor God's children as individuals can outrun their past, at least by themselves. And that is indicated by the highlighted term former deeds. Now, I realize former deeds isn't the translation in all translations, but it's there in the Hebrew. And it's so vivid that the theologian Brevard Childs rightly asked, quote, but could there be a resonance of second Isaiah's use of former things which belong to the old age, as opposed to God's new things in Isaiah 41, 42, 48, etc.? He says it's hardly accidental that the designation former troubles is going to appear later in verse 16, and that in verse 17, former things will not be remembered, just like it says in Isaiah 43:18. So what we have here is this idea that there is a cost for former deeds, but we have a hope that there's a way to erase those former deeds. Now, because verse 8 changes the tone from describing those who rebel against God to talking about those who strive to serve God, there are some scholars who think that verses 1 through 7 were originally a separate sermon. However, as you saw from Dr. Kelly's outline earlier, and as Klaus Westermann insists, based on the line, I do not destroy them all, there is an idea that this next section is tied to this section very closely. And it makes sense to see verses 8 through 16 as being a counterbalance to the indictment. Because God doesn't just punish, God blesses. So just as we counted 7 participles that represented rebellion against God in the first 4 verses, now we're going to find 7 references to servants in this section, verses 8 through 15. We find it in verse 8, in verse 9, 3 times in verse 13, in verse 14, and in verse 15. So let's look at that. The first use is not to be destroyed because of blessing. So says Yahweh. Just as juice or new wine is found in the grape cluster. And in relation to that, he says, don't destroy it because there is blessing in it. So I will accomplish on behalf of my servants to not destroy them all. Now, I like the comparison of God now as vineyard owner compared to farmer in Isaiah chapter 28. But in contrast to the judgment, it sounds like the vineyard owner is getting ready to order the workers to get rid of all the grapes. But because of the blessing in it, and those of you who are alert have probably noticed that several times in this passage, my translation has that because all in caps, which represents the Hebrew particle ki, which that's the way it's pronounced, ki, which sounds like it's a key thought. And the key thought in verse 8 is certainly there's still juice, there's still blessing, so God isn't going to destroy it all. Maybe just pull out some bad grapes, maybe just pull out some unripe grapes and then do the crushing and get the juice, the blessing thereafter. Now, this is really an important lesson, I think, because it indicates that as God's servants, we're able to provide value, blessing, and purpose whenever we follow him instead of doing what these first verses said and opposing him. So, despite the imperfect and the unripe grapes in the cluster, then God is paying attention to the juicy ones. So that's one use of the servants. The servants are spared because God has in mind to make them a blessing, the grape juice or the new wine. But that's not all. In verse 9, so I will cause to come forth from Jacob a seed, and from Judah heirs to my mountains. And my chosen shall possess it, and my servants shall reside there. They'll live in the land of promise. They'll live in the mountains of Judah. Now, that is a blessing. That is a promise. That is something that is terrific. And then verse 10 goes further. And by the way, I don't have all of the verses on slides, but they're all in the notes with my translation. So, when I upload them tomorrow night, you'll know. And the plain of Sharon shall become pasture for flocks, and the valley of trouble, literally Achor, for a resting place for cattle, for my people who have diligently looked for me. So things are sounding pretty good. In verse 9, there will be a seed from Jacob's lineage. Now, seed is used to describe genetic inheritance in the Old Testament, but also here it's used as part of metaphor because we're talking about Israel as a garden. And so verse 10 describes an idyllic locale where even the valley of trouble, Achor. Do you remember Achan in the book of Joshua? Where did he get in trouble? It was in the valley of Achor. But now even the valley of trouble will be a bountiful and restful place. However, as every gardener knows, gardens in this world require some weeding. So guess what? Verses 11 and 12 tell us about that weeding. But you emphasized the ones forsaking Yahweh, the ones who have forgotten the mountain of my holiness. What is the mountain of his holiness? It's Mount Zion. It's Temple Hill. So these people have left God, they've left his worship, and they've forgotten what was important about his worship, forgotten what is important about what he was doing. You who spread the table for Gad and fill up bowls of wine for Mani or Manat. Oh, I did put it here, so here it is. And I will appoint you for execution, and all of you will bend over for slaughter, since I called, but you didn't answer. I spoke, but you didn't hear. So who are the weeds? They're those who refuse to have a relationship with God, who have forsaken him, who have forgotten worship, who don't bother to go to church anymore. They don't go to Temple Hill. They don't go to Mount Zion. And who are they? They are those who depend upon luck. They spend lavishly on Gad. Now, on the left-hand side, this little God figure is Gad, Guess who he is? He is the God of luck, the God of fortune. You know, even though we think we are a rational world, even though we think we're scientific, have you ever noticed how many people still have superstitious ideas about luck? The luck that goes with die rolls, the luck that allows me to make a good deal, the luck that gave me a job, the luck that blessed me. Guess what? God doesn't like that idea because God has purpose in our lives. And that purpose in our lives call for us to deliberately, to willfully determine to do what God wants us to do. So there's Gad, the God of luck and fortune. And it's one thing that some people still falsely worship today. So either they're living carelessly like a drunkard, or maybe they're, using the wine to divine one's fortune from Mene or Manat. Mene was the goddess of fate at Ebla, which is up in Phoenicia. Manat was another Middle Eastern goddess of fate, and that's her picture there. But you notice whether you're Greek or whether you're Middle Eastern, whenever you start talking about fate or destiny, you end up seeing three women. In Greek mythology, they call them the Fates, and they have different names, and one of them represents the past, and one of them represents the present, and one represents the future. And in this case, they are filling up bowls of wine for the goddess of fate or destiny. Now, are they drunkards who don't care anymore? Apparently not, because it's for the goddess of fate or destiny. So, more likely, what it is filling the goblet with wine in order to divine the will of fate, or as pictured here, the fates. Either way, this is not depending upon God for our way of living, not depending upon God for wisdom, not depending on God for purpose. And it just isn't living in faith. And both the way of luck and the way of fate is designated for destruction, humiliating destruction. God says, I'll appoint you for the sword. Now, this is an interesting word, appoint. Now, this is the word that's used in administration in the royal court to describe the king, the royal sovereign, selecting someone to be his vizier, selecting someone to be his exchequer, selecting someone to be in charge of this province or that province as a satrap. This is that idea. But also in the Hebrew Bible, it also has this idea of God appointing. And pardon me if Jonah comes to mind because I've been working on it so much, but that word for appointed, that verb that's used here, is used throughout Jonah because God appointed a great fish and God appointed a gourd and God appointed a sirocco, a hot east wind, and God appointed a worm. You see, God was heavily involved. But here it's saying, don't count on fate because God has appointed your fate if you don't learn to answer him, if you don't learn to hear him with the intention of obeying. So says Lord Yahweh. Check it out. My servant shall eat, but you, the emphasis is there in the Hebrew, but you shall go hungry. Check it out. My servant shall drink, but you will go thirsty. Check it out. My servants will rejoice, but you will be shamed. Check it out. My servants will sing with innermost joy. Actually, that's sing in their heart, sing in their will, sing in their determination, sing inside. But you'll cry out from sorrow, and you will lament from weakness of spirit. So you'll leave behind your name to my chosen ones for a curse, and Lord Yahweh will consign you to death. But for his servants, they'll be called by another name. Whomever blesses himself in the land, he will bless by means of God, who is foundational. And whomever commits himself, takes an oath in the land, he will commit or take an oath by means of God, who is foundational. Now, remind me to come back to this because God, who is foundational, needs some explanation. But let's look at our list again. I said there were 7. So here's 3 right here in verse 13. My servant shall eat while the rebels go hungry. My servant shall drink while the rebels thirst. My servant shall rejoice while the rebels are shamed. My servants shall sing aloud because of their inner gladness while the rebels are crying. And my servants shall receive a new name. Now, I particularly wanted to speak to this idea of the new name, because in the ancient world, as many times in this world, whenever a person is adopted into a family, they receive a new name. Whenever a servant is set free, they receive a new name. And one of the things I loved about Nigerian tradition was that when Nigerians are born, they're given a traditional Nigerian name. But when Nigerians accept Christ and are going to follow the Lord in baptism, they are expected to research a biblical character and to choose that biblical name to become their legal name. And so, for example, I don't remember the traditional name of my friend Samuel Fudeji, but when he accepted Christ and was baptized, one of his tasks was to research, and he decided that Samuel was the role model from the Bible that he wanted to be like. And so he ended up in ministry. He ended up as a professor. He ended up serving God as a wise man like Samuel. And he served the Lord in that way. And so it was a new identity. It means part of a new family. And that's an important factor. And then I'm going to back up here. I also want to call your attention to, he will bless by means of God who is foundational. He will commit by means of God who is foundational. Most translations are going to say, by means of the true God. So why did Pastor Johnny translate it as foundational? Because literally what it says is the God of Amen, or the God of Aman, which doesn't mean Amman, Jordan. It's the verb from which we get amen, which means to found, to establish, to make firm. This is God you can bet your life on. This is God you can depend on. This is God who provides a solid foundation that you can build on. And that's very significant. And it's something that we need to remember. Whenever we bless ourselves by accomplishing something with God's grace, it's by means of God who enabled us to build on his work. And whenever we commit to something, even though I don't believe in taking oaths, but when we commit to something, we commit by means of God and God's promised help of helping us to follow through. And that is very significant. So we have 7 uses of servants, 7 promises. And so we have gotten through D prime, the indictment of corrupt worship, with the promise of transfer of leadership, of faithfulness, of blessing to God's servants, to the faithful. But now, if you look up at C, you see in chapter 57, we had the proclamation of salvation for the people. And now we have the proclamation of salvation for the people, but it isn't just people. It affects everything, the heavens and the earth. So the verses we just finished with give us a vivid contrast in terms of the results of 2 different lifestyles. So despite God's intent to bless and God's willingness to assist in blessing by means of God in verse 16, notice that the ultimate decision remains with the humans. As humans, we don't get to play the victim card with God. And like it or not, Israel didn't get to play the victim card either. But even though we bear responsibility for our relationship and our service for God, it's really good to know it doesn't all rely on us. And it's good to know the past isn't written with indelible ink when God decides to do something new in our lives or in the greater world. So we see the new creation starting in verse 17. So listen to God talking. Because, check me out, the one creating as only God can, new heavens and new earth, and the first things won't be remembered and won't come to mind. It's literally ascend to the heart. Because then you shall rejoice and celebrate forever in what I continue to create as only God can. Because, check it out, I am creating as only God can to create a Jerusalem to celebrate and her people as joyfulness. So I myself will celebrate in Jerusalem and rejoice with my people, and the sound of tears and the voice of crying won't be heard in her anymore. So the first thing you may notice here is the similarity between the start of this passage and the end of Revelation in the New Testament. And I do have a brief comparison on the slide in front of you. But before I get to that, I need to explain my translation. Creating as only God can. Now, if you were Hebrew readers, you would probably know that the very first few words in the Bible are Bereshith bara Elohim. And that is In a beginning, God, or actually literally, God in a plural of majesty or God's plural, he created singular. But it isn't just singular in terms of the tense, he created. It's also singular in that the only one who ever uses that verb in the Bible is God. Only God baras. In every book of the Old Testament, the only subject of the verb bara is God. And guess what's used in Isaiah 65, verses 17 and 25? It is the participle of bara, creating as only God can create. This is not something that's going to happen by means of evolution. This is not going to happen by means of natural process. This is something that's going to happen with God's direct intervention. It's not what we really know. So, in chapter 65, verse 17, the one creating as only God can new heavens and new earth. And in Revelation 21:1, John the seer says, then I saw new heavens and new earth. In 65:17, and the first things won't be remembered. And in Revelation chapter 21:4, it says, because the first things will be over. They'll be done. Now, some of your translations say, because the former things will have passed away. But the idea is they've been left behind. They're over. It's God stepping in. And then we come back to verse 18. And I am creating as only God can create a Jerusalem to celebrate. And in Revelation 21:2, and I saw the holy city, a new Jerusalem coming down from heaven. And then, of course, one of the more famous lines in verse 19, the sound of tears and the voice of crying won't be heard in her, Jerusalem, anymore. And in 21:4, neither mourning nor crying out is to be heard. But even as there's a tremendous similarity, the contrast of the former things to the new things that are expressed in the Isaiah text, when we transform a desert into abundantly watered places, when firm roads get placed in a pathless wilderness, when a joyous return of enslaved people to a holy land with freedom and a new built prosperity among the sanctity of Zion, those are the climax of a passage in which God is helping humans to create peace into the world. And a new world in those texts is conditional. In those older passages, they're conditional on historically identifiable events in which God creates anew, even if the language is highly picturesque. But Revelation 21 takes those same themes and it takes them into something far beyond history. The history that we can measure, the history that we can know, gives us hope, but it points to the future. So, not only do we have the hope, the new heavens and the new earth, But if you go back up to the top to B, you see the indictment of wicked leaders. Now, in B prime, that's the first 6 verses of chapter 66, we have the indictment of wicked leaders, but we also have the idea that these leaders are so wicked that they are pushing the faithful, God's servants, out of the cult. Something is happening in Israel that God does not approve of and that needs to be changed. There's still work that needs to be done. So says Yahweh, heaven is my throne and earth is my footstool. Where could you build a house for me? What could serve as my resting place? Now, you may recognize the picture down below. That's the base of Herod's temple. And then those are medieval structures up on it. And if you went further up on it, you would see that despicable mosque that's on it even today. But God's question still holds. Even if you were able to tear down that mosque, how could you build a house for God? And what could serve as God's resting place? Oops. There are basically 3 major issues in Isaiah 66. One is rebuilding the temple. So you remember when Ezra and Nehemiah get back there, they see what pitiful shape the walls are in. They see what pitiful shape the temple's in, and they begin preaching to people about how they need to rebuild the temple, reconstruct the temple. But guess what? Not everybody wants to invest in something like that. We can see it even in churches today. Now, I'm not complaining about building programs here, but what I am saying is there are times in church where you lose a program or you lose a ministry, and later you come back and you try to rebuild, and nobody wants to rebuild it. Or at least you don't have a critical mass of people that want to rebuild it. Let's just keep going like we're going. And essentially, the people who were behind and the people that came into exile are saying, well, we've got some other priorities. We got to get our fields cleaned up. We got to rebuild our houses. We got to do all this. And we don't really have time to rebuild the temple. We don't really have the capital to invest in it. So if you want to see a vivid rendition of this, read the book of Haggai, because he's really lost patience. That prophet really lost patience with them because they're not engaged in rebuilding. Well, in this case, when Isaiah is talking, when the prophet going by the name of Isaiah is talking, he's saying, it's not that God needs us to do this for him, because God already has a grand place. The whole universe is his throne, and earth is his footstool. He doesn't even have to completely sit on it in order to rule. So we've got to spend our time rebuilding the temple. And then the second major issue is the nature of the temple and what true worship is. Because those people who were traditional priests are saying, hey, why rebuild the temple? We're getting our offerings, and the tithes are coming in, we're being repaid, we're taken care of, we have the respect. We don't need to do anything like this. And so it's a problem. And then the third issue is, what is the true nature of God? Well, that is a significant question. So notice the contamination that had taken place within these people's lives. All of these things were accomplished by my hand, says God. And so all of these happened, a saying of Yahweh. But notice the contamination. Notice the taint coming in. For those who slaughter an ox, which could be a proper sacrifice, and kill a person, they got the wrong blood on their hands. Or for those who sacrifice a sheep and break the neck of a dog, the dogs were considered to be nasty curs. They were considered to be very low forms of life. And to break the neck of a dog to sacrifice in the temple would just be a disgrace. But it gets worse. Who make a grain offering and offer pig's blood. Oh, wow. Talk about unkosher. Talk about disgusting. Who burn incense and worship an idol. Waylene says I use this word too much, but syncretism. It's that idea of just trying to add stuff in to God's worship, add stuff in to God's word, to add in to our theology without really trying to focus on the true nature of God, God's true person. So these persons have chosen their own ways, and they delight in their abominations. So can you see why there was a controversy? For some people, it's why should we rebuild the temple for these corrupt crooks, these contaminated people to do what they want to do? That's not really true worship anyway. And for others, it's how can you expect them to be respectful of sacrifices when we don't have a true place of worship? And that's the way it goes. So God says, even so, I will choose their harsh judgment and bring upon them what they fear, or many translations make dread, because when I called, no one answered. Have we heard that before tonight? When I called, no one answered? Yeah, we just did. In the previous chapter. When I spoke, no one heard with the view to obey. They accomplished evil in my sight, and they chose what I do not permit. So hear the word of Yahweh, you who tremble at his words, your relatives who hate you and exclude you because of my name. They say, let Yahweh be glorified, that we may see your joy. Yet it is they who will be put to shame. So here he's talking about those people who want to be faithful, and yet the other people are making fun of them. They say, let Yahweh be glorified. What that means is we want to see a show. And what that means is we want to be entertained in the temple that we may see your joy. We want something that benefits us and not necessarily anything that benefits God and God's people. But God says, these are the ones who will be put to shame. Now, when we get to Isaiah chapter 66, verse 6, Well, you'll notice in my translation, even though I've only put a few phrases in here so I can compare it with Second Thessalonians. So hear that commotion from the city, that uproar from within the temple. See, there's conflict in the temple. There's a major confrontation taking place in the temple. But in that, it is the sound of Yahweh exercising payback on his enemies. Now, in the LXX, the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, the word for enemies is a participle, the ones opposing him. So when they saw enemies, they recognized we're talking about opposition. Now, then in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, it's talking about the man of lawlessness, essentially the abomination of desolation, one of the antichrists, if you will. And what does this guy do? He opposes, much like the ones that are opposing Yahweh here from within the temple. He opposes and he exalts himself above every so-called God or object of worship so that he takes his seat in the temple of God, declaring himself to be God. And so you say, how is this relevant? Well, we've already been reading in Isaiah 65 about new heaven and a new earth, about former things passing away. So we are talking about the idea of a new realm, a new regime. And that seems appropriate because Second Thessalonians is talking about why is the Lord hesitating in his return? Why haven't we seen the last days yet? Why isn't God working according to our schedule? Which sounds a whole lot like the question in chapter 64 that we started with. How long are you going to be silent, God? How long before you intervene? Now, in this case, it appears that there is opposition. It appears that there's a problem, a false religion that has set itself up, and that God isn't quite ready to deal with yet. But we know from the hint in Isaiah 66:6 that God will deal with this man of lawlessness. God will exercise payback on those who oppose him. So after we get through the first 6 verses of this chapter, we look way back at the beginning of the bookends, proclamation of salvation for foreigners. And in the last verses of this chapter, a lot of them, the proclamation of salvation, including foreigners. And it adds specifically the foreigners to this idea of salvation. So let's look at Isaiah 66, verses 15 to 16. Check it out. Yahweh will come in fire, and his chariots like a whirlwind. He will vent his anger in fury and his rage with flames of fire. For with fire and sword will Yahweh execute judgment upon all people, and those slain by Yahweh will be many. And in 2 Thessalonians 1, the Lord Jesus is revealed from heaven with his mighty angels in flaming fire. And he inflicts vengeance, payback, on those who don't know God and those who don't obey the gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ. So even in the New Testament idea of last times, there is an idea of judgment. You can't have the new heaven and the new earth without getting rid of the taint, the corruption, the entropy of the old heaven and the old earth. There has to be a replacement. But the good news is that when we get to verse 18, what we have is God gathering all nations and tongues to come and behold God's glory. And it specifies 4 different civilizations, one of which is Tarshish. If you look way over on the left in the Iberian Peninsula, where Spain and Portugal are, that's Tarshish. That's the farthest boundary of the world for these people. And it is saying that Tarshish is going to come and behold God's glory, as well as Poole. Now, if you'd attended Waylene's Sunday school class, you would know who Poole was, because she talked a lot about Tiglath-Pileser III of Assyria, who was the big, bad conqueror. Now, certainly, by the time this Isaiah is prophesying, Poole has been dead for centuries, but everybody would know who Poole was. Everybody would know what Nineveh was, and they would know that this was the Assyrian, Babylonian, Mede, Persian area from which they've been in captivity. And yet these are the people that God is going to gather together to come and behold God's glory. And what about Lud? Well, there are many places that are associated with Lud, but Lud, in its linguistic root, is close to Lydia. And guess where Lydia is? It's in southern Turkey, in the Turkish peninsula. Or what about Javan? Javan was one of the sons of Japheth. Who is that? Oh, that's the Greeks. That's the Grecian peninsula. So look at what's happening here. God is drawing people from every corner of the earth to bring glory to his name. Now, were the people in Isaiah 66 ready for this? Were the people in Isaiah 66 going to be part of this? In some ways. In the post-exilic period, we begin to have some proselytes coming to Israel, and that in turn prepares the way for Paul's ministry to the Gentiles. Oh, wasn't that sneaky? I got in Paul's ministry to the Gentiles, which takes us right back to the beginning of our study tonight, where in Romans chapter 10, Paul's talking about, hey, if the Jews don't listen, if the Jews don't pay attention, God's going to go beyond them. And sure enough, here is the prophecy in Isaiah, God's going to go beyond them. And sure enough, Paul's ministry was part of God going beyond them. And that's an exciting idea of global ministry. And that's the way it is. So not only is Isaiah 66 rich in promise to the returning exiles, but Isaiah 66 probably influenced the consideration of the final days on earth as we see it in 2 Thessalonians chapter 1 and chapter 2, and the last part of Isaiah 65 influencing Revelation chapter 21. So even though we may think a lot of this last part of Isaiah is about something that happened way back when. It's something that God continued to make happen and that God will continue to make happen and that we're still hoping for. All the nations and tongues beholding God's glory and a new heaven and a new earth with all the other stuff being forgotten because it's over and God is doing something new. And this ends the lesson.